6 interruptions. 6 times Stephen Miller's voice cut across hers like a blade, slicing through sentences, stomping on every attempt she made to finish a thought. The room had already grown heavy with the tension of his arrogance, the kind that doesn't argue in good faith but thrives on domination. Every word out of his mouth dripped with that familiar smugness. Every interjection a reminder that he wasn't there to listen, he was there to silence. And yet Jasmine Crockett refused to fold. She sat steady, her gaze locked forward, her posture refusing to yield even as the storm bore down on her. Each time he interrupted, you could see the calculation behind her eyes, an unspoken decision not to flinch, not to let him steal her composure. Around them the murmurs began, journalists shifting in their seats, lawmakers raising eyebrows. Even the cameras, unblinking and merciless, seemed to lean in closer, catching every twitch of Miller's lips, every tightening of Crockett's jaw. By the 6th time, the room wasn't just uncomfortable, it was on edge. You could almost hear the question buzzing in the air. How much more would she take? Miller smirked, confident, relishing the attention he carved out with every interruption. He leaned in, voice booming, convinced that the louder he barked, the smaller she would seem. But Crockett wasn't shrinking. She was waiting, timing, building. Every dismissal he threw, every attempt to bulldoze her, was stacking a tower of tension, brick by brick. The silence after the 6th interruption felt electric, as if the entire room knew something had to give. Even Miller's words seemed to hang for a moment too long, suspended in arrogance, daring her to respond. And that's when the hook embedded itself, not just in that chamber, but in the hearts of everyone watching. 6 interruptions. And then, the 7th moment that silenced Stephen Miller forever. What no one knew then, what not even Miller could see as he leaned back with that practiced air of superiority, was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply enduring his assaults. She was preparing, and the line she had waiting for him wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reckoning, because the 7th time the silence would belong to her. To understand the weight of that exchange, you have to rewind the clock just a little. This wasn't just another hearing on Capitol Hill. This was a stage, a theater of power, where reputations are built and dismantled under the unforgiving glare of lights and cameras. Every word spoken in that room would ripple outward, into news broadcasts, into social media feeds, into living rooms across America. And everyone present knew it. Stephen Miller, of course, entered with his reputation preceding him. To his supporters, he was a pit bull, relentless and unflinching. To his critics, he was something far less flattering, the face of arrogance, a man who weaponized words not to clarify or debate, but to steamroll and humiliate. He was notorious for his interruptions, the way he cut opponents off mid-sentence, the way he wore down their composure with a smirk and a sneer. It was a tactic as old as power itself, dominate the room by never letting the other side breathe. And Jasmine Crockett, she was not supposed to be the star of this story. At least that's what the cynics thought. Young, black, a freshman congresswoman from Texas. She was often underestimated in these high-pressure arenas. Some saw her as fiery but inexperienced, passionate but untested against political operatives like Miller, who had sharpened his teeth in the bruising battles of the Trump White House. In their eyes, she was supposed to be just another target, another opponent steamrolled by his voice. But what those skeptics missed was the steel beneath her composure. Crockett had spent years in courtrooms, standing up for clients who had no one else to fight for them. She had been underestimated before, dismissed before, silenced before, and she had survived it every time. This hearing was no different. The cameras might have magnified the stage, but the dynamic was one she knew well, a man convinced he could talk over her, and her quiet resolve not to let him. That's why the interruptions mattered. They weren't just rudeness. They weren't just politics as usual. They were a test of respect, a clash of philosophies about who deserves to be heard in America. Every time Miller bulldozed over her words, he wasn't just dismissing Crockett. He was dismissing the millions who see themselves reflected in her story. And every time she refused to buckle, she was carrying those millions with her. The tension in that room was more than personal. It was generational, racial, political. It was a battle over who gets to hold the floor, who gets to speak with authority, and who gets relegated to the sidelines. Miller believed the script was already written. He was the loud voice, the seasoned operative, the man with the smirk that said he'd seen this play before. Crockett, in his mind, was just a supporting character. But arrogance has a way of blinding men like him. He didn't see the way the audience leaned in with every interruption. He didn't notice the growing restlessness in the room, the sense that something was building beneath Crockett's measured calm. He thought he was controlling the moment. In reality, he was handing it to her piece by piece, interruption by interruption. And then came the silence after the sixth time. That was when everyone realized the balance had shifted. This wasn't Miller's performance anymore. It was Crockett's setup. But what no one expected was how she would flip the... To understand why Stephen Miller's presence in that hearing carried such weight, and why his eventual silence struck with the force of a hammer, you have to step back and look at the man himself. Miller has never been just another political operative. He has been, for years, the architect of combative rhetoric and hardline postures that left their mark on an entire era of American politics. A former senior advisor to President Trump, he cut his teeth crafting policy with an edge so sharp it divided the country like a blade. His name became synonymous with confrontation. His reputation, built on an unyielding refusal to compromise and a talent for wielding words like weapons. But reputation is a double-edged sword. For Miller, it became armor and it became poison. He walked into rooms like this hearing cloaked in notoriety, carrying the assumption that his mere presence would dominate the conversation. His trademark style, leaning forward, voice rising just enough to demand attention, that unmistakable sneer etched across his face, was designed to project superiority. To his admirers, it looked like strength. To his opponents, it reeked of arrogance. And arrogance was his currency. Time and again, Miller had scolded others about civility, about maintaining order in discourse, about the supposed dignity of institutions. He lectured opponents on the importance of respect, while punctuating his sentences with interruptions, dismissive gestures, and derisive laughter. It was the hypocrisy that grated most. The man who insisted others respect the rules was the same man who broke them whenever it suited him. In his hands, civility was not a principle, it was a cudgel, a weapon to silence those he deemed beneath him. That's what made this clash with Jasmine Crockett so volatile. She wasn't just another opponent. She was everything Miller had spent years dismissing. A young black woman, outspoken, unafraid, unwilling to shrink before his barbs. To him, she was a challenge that had to be cut down. And so he did what he always did. He interrupted, again and again, convinced that volume and persistence would wear her down. But there was something different in the air this time. Watch closely in the footage and you can see it. The way his interruptions grew sharper, louder, more desperate. They weren't just tactics. They were symptoms. Symptoms of a man who could sense, deep down, that his old tricks were losing their effect. His sneer no longer landed as devastating. It landed as tired. His cutting tone no longer dominated the room. It grated on it. The contrast between Miller and Crockett was cinematic in its clarity. He embodied the villain archetype, smugness radiating from every gesture, an almost theatrical disdain for his opponent. She embodied composure, quiet dignity laced with restrained fire. Side by side, the imbalance was glaring. One man clawing for control, one woman refusing to surrender it. And still, Miller leaned into his performance, doubling down on the arrogance that had carried him this far. He believed the pattern would hold: interrupt, dominate, sneer, dismiss. He mistook Crockett's patience for weakness, her silence for surrender, her restraint for intimidation. What he didn't recognize was that she was studying him, letting him expose himself more with every word. That's the irony of arrogance. It blinds. It convinces men like Stephen Miller that the script can never be rewritten, that the roles of victor and victim are fixed forever. He couldn't see that the very smugness on which he relied was painting him into a corner. He couldn't hear that his own tone, once sharp, now rang hollow. He couldn't feel that the room, instead of rallying to his authority, was slipping away from him, shifting its energy to the woman he thought he was silencing. And so by the time interruption number 6 fell flat, Miller's fate was already sealed. He thought he had built himself a fortress of power, when in reality he was standing on quicksand. Every smirk, every sneer, every interruption was pulling him deeper, setting the stage not for his triumph, but for his undoing. Because arrogance is a character flaw with a predictable ending, and in that hearing before the cameras, before the country, Stephen Miller was walking straight into it. That arrogance would soon be his before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that hearing room, before the cameras and the microphones and the showdown with Stephen Miller. She had already lived a life that shaped her into the kind of fighter who doesn't flinch when the pressure mounts. Her story begins in Texas, where resilience isn't a choice but a necessity. Raised in a community where opportunities were often scarce and the odds rarely favored those who looked like her, Crockett learned early what it meant to push back against being underestimated. She didn't come from a gilded background, nor did she have the luxury of being groomed for political power. Her strength was forged in struggle. Law was not simply a career for her, it was a calling, a weapon in the fight for dignity. As a civil rights attorney, she stood shoulder to shoulder with those the system tried hardest to forget: the marginalized, the voiceless, the accused who never had a fair shot. Day after day, courtroom after courtroom, she faced down prosecutors, skeptics, and judges who sometimes saw only her youth, her race, her gender, instead of the substance of her arguments. And yet she won. Not always in verdicts, though she had her share of those, but in presence, in persistence, in refusing to be silenced. She built her career on a kind of fiery advocacy that was as much about principle as it was about her clients. To watch her argue was to watch someone who had mastered the balance between passion and control. She could be sharp, even biting, when the moment called for it, but she never lost sight of the higher ground. That balance is what brought her to Congress. Her election wasn't the product of a dynastic machine. It was the result of grit, organizing, and the trust she earned from people who recognized in her someone who would not abandon them once the cameras turned off. In Washington, she quickly gained a reputation as a truth-teller, someone unafraid to speak plainly, even when her words ruffled feathers. And because she didn't fit the mold of who power expected to see, because she was young, black, a woman, unapologetically herself, she was underestimated time and again. It is precisely that underestimation that made her dangerous to someone like Stephen Miller. He thrives on chaos, on rattling opponents, on turning composure into rubble. But Crockett is forged from a different fire. Where Miller brings noise, she brings clarity. Where he tries to dominate with volume, she commands with presence. Where his smugness distracts, her calm focuses. In her, the chaos he wields finds no purchase. That calm is not weakness, it is strategy. Anyone who has lived through being doubted, dismissed, and disrespected learns the art of patience. Crockett's patience is born not from timidity, but from knowing when to strike. Every insult she has ever absorbed, every sideways glance, every attempt to diminish her prepared her for moments like this one. It taught her that timing is everything. That restraint is not surrender but preparation. This is why the audience begins rooting for her long before her famous 7th line. It isn't just about the hearing. It's about every battle she represents. For women who have been spoken over in boardrooms, for people of color whose voices have been dismissed in classrooms, for every immigrant child whose parents were told they didn't belong, Crockett sits at that table carrying more than her own dignity. She carries theirs too. With each interruption Miller throws, it's not just Crockett he's trying to silence. It's everyone who has ever been told they are too loud, too young, too different to matter. And so the emotional weight builds. Viewers at home don't just watch her, they see themselves in her. They feel the injustice of Miller's arrogance as though it were directed at them. Each interruption stings, not because Crockett falters, but because it echoes a larger pattern the audience knows all too well. And when she doesn't break, when she sits steady, waiting for her moment, they begin to anticipate the turn. They crave it, not simply for entertainment, but for validation. By the sixth interruption, the stage is fully set. Crockett's composure is no longer simply impressive, it's heroic. The audience leans in, their frustration mirroring hers, their hope hinging on her next move. Miller believes he is winning, but the truth is clear to anyone watching. He is building her platform higher with every arrogant word, and when the seventh interruption comes, it doesn't arrive as a surprise. It arrives as inevitability. Miller, blinded by his own hubris, delivers the final opening. The moment Crockett has been waiting for, and she does not miss it, because when Jasmine Crockett finally decides to respond, she doesn't just answer back. She doesn't just defend herself. She detonates. The hearing began like so many others. Controlled chaos, the shuffle of papers, the low hum of whispers, the click of cameras. Jasmine Crockett had the floor, and with it, the burden of cutting through the noise. Her words were measured, deliberate, carrying the kind of gravity that comes from lived experience rather than rehearsed sound bites. But then came the first interruption. Stephen Miller leaned forward, his voice slicing through hers, loud and dismissive. He didn't even let her finish her sentence. For a brief second, the air caught. Crockett did not flinch. She didn't raise her voice or break her rhythm. She paused, collected herself, and continued as if the interruption were nothing more than static on a line. That composure spoke volumes. It told the room that she had been here before. It told Miller that his first strike had missed. The second interruption came sharper, more deliberate, Miller's tone dripping with contempt. This time, Crockett's response shifted ever so slightly. Her words still flowed, but a subtle edge laced her tone. A flicker of irritation passed across her face, quickly replaced by determination. Those watching could sense it, the beginning of a shift, a glimpse of the steel beneath her calm. Miller, perhaps sensing he hadn't rattled her enough, pushed harder. By the fourth and fifth interruptions, the room itself began to change. No longer was this just an exchange between two individuals. Lawmakers exchanged glances. Journalists scribbled notes faster, their pens pressing into the paper. Cameras zoomed in tighter, searching for that one frame, the breaking point. Even the public gallery seemed to lean forward, caught between disbelief and anticipation. Crockett's words were now fighting for space against Miller's constant barbs, but her refusal to be drowned out only amplified her presence. Each time she regained the floor, her resolve seemed stronger, sharper. Each time Miller interjected, his smugness seemed more desperate, less effective. The tension had become palpable, a string pulled taut across the chamber. By the sixth interruption, exasperation finally surfaced. Crockett paused longer than before, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressing together in a way that said everything words could not. This was no longer just about her testimony. It was about respect, about the very right to be heard. The frustration in the room mirrored her own. Viewers at home could feel it in their chests, the collective weight of watching someone repeatedly silenced. Miller, oblivious or unwilling to see what was unfolding, leaned back with that same air of superiority he had perfected over years of televised combat. He believed he was controlling the narrative, bending the moment to his will. But in reality, each interruption was no longer a show of dominance, it was a countdown. And the silence after that sixth interruption wasn't just silence, it was suspense. It was the pause before the curtain rises, the breath before the orchestra strikes. Crockett's eyes flickered with the spark of someone who knows her moment has arrived. The cameras seemed to sense it too, catching the faintest shift in her expression. The room was holding its breath. The seventh time, however, everything changed. The seventh interruption came almost predictably, Stephen Miller's voice rising over Jasmine Crockett's, sharp, insistent, meant to once again cut her off mid-thought. But this time, she did not simply pause and press forward. She let the interruption land. She let it hang in the air, giving Miller the full rope of his arrogance. And then, in a move that felt less like politics and more like theater, she leaned forward, locked her gaze on him, and delivered the line that no one in that chamber would ever forget. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, steady, and razor-sharp. "Mr. Miller," she began, her tone carrying the controlled fire of someone who has endured far too much and finally chosen the precise moment to release it. "If you're so afraid of my words that you can't let me finish a single sentence, maybe it's not my arguments you're worried about. Maybe it's the truth." The silence that followed was instant, electric. For the first time all day, Miller said nothing. His lips, always quick with a comeback, froze mid-smirk. The room seemed to tilt toward Crockett, as if every ear and every eye had been pulled into her orbit. Journalists stopped scribbling and simply stared. Lawmakers shifted in their seats. A gasp rippled faintly from the back of the gallery. It wasn't just a clapback. It was a career-defining strike. Let's break down why. Crockett's setup was surgical. By acknowledging his interruptions, she reframed the narrative. No longer was Miller the aggressor and she the silenced. In that moment, she became the one naming the dynamic out loud, flipping the script so that every viewer, every reporter, every colleague was forced to see Miller for what he was. Not powerful, not clever, but insecure. His tactic of dominance was exposed as desperation, and she did it with fewer than 50 words. Then came the strike itself. "Maybe it's not my arguments you're worried about. Maybe it's the truth." With that line, she didn't just defend herself, she accused. She positioned herself as the bearer of truth and Miller as the man afraid of it. It was a reversal so sharp that it cut through every ounce of smugness he had built up in the previous 6 interruptions. Suddenly, the man who had wielded his voice like a weapon found himself disarmed. The crowd's reaction sealed the moment. It wasn't loud applause. Hearings don't work that way. But the sounds that did emerge were just as powerful. The murmured gasps, the subtle shifts, the audible from someone in the gallery. Those noises told the story. Even the unspoken reactions, the widened eyes, the heads turning toward Miller to see how he would respond, carried weight. This was the sound of the room recognizing a turning point. And then there was Miller himself. His unraveling was almost cinematic. He blinked as if the words had landed harder than he expected. He opened his mouth, searching for a retort, but nothing came out. For a man who prided himself on always having the last word, the silence was devastating. His fingers tapped nervously on the table. His gaze shifted downward for just a moment. The smallest tell, but one that spoke volumes. Narration carried the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a reckoning. The arrogance that had carried Stephen Miller through countless confrontations had finally met its match in Jasmine Crockett's precision. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted. Crockett, for her part, didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or stretch the moment for applause. She simply allowed the silence to work in her favor. That restraint amplified the power of her words. She had detonated a truth bomb, and she knew it didn't need repeating. The room, the cameras, the audience watching at home, they would carry it forward for her. And carry it forward they did. Already, tweets were firing off from the gallery. "Did you see that?" One journalist typed furiously. Another scribbled in bold letters, "Crockett shuts down Miller." The clip would soon flood timelines, edited into short videos with captions blazing across the screen. 6 interruptions, silenced on the 7th. But in that chamber, before the world caught up, the moment belonged to Crockett alone. Her eyes never wavered from Miller. Her body language radiated calm dominance, a living contrast to his stiff, faltering silence. In that quiet, she seemed to embody not just herself, but the generations of voices who had been told to sit down, be quiet, wait their turn. She was all of them in that instant, and she did not blink. What makes a mic drop moment isn't just the line itself. It's everything that surrounds it. The build-up, the tension, the contrast between chaos and composure. Crockett's 7th response carried all of that. 6 times she had been interrupted. 6 times she had chosen patience. But the 7th time, she unleashed a line that will live far longer than the hearing itself. And Miller? He never recovered. Oh, he tried to regain his footing. He attempted to stumble into another interruption, to laugh it off, to pretend her words hadn't sliced through him. But the damage was done. The sneer looked forced. The words sounded hollow. The arrogance rang weak. The unraveling wasn't loud. It was quiet, almost pitiful. The man who thrived on control had lost it, and everyone knew it. The narration lingered on the fallout in the room. Sometimes history doesn't shout. Sometimes it whispers, in the silence of a man who suddenly has nothing left to say. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just scored a point in a political debate. She had authored a defining moment, one destined to ripple far beyond the walls of that chamber. Because in politics there are clapbacks and then there are reckonings, and this was the latter. The clip hit the internet like a lightning strike. Within minutes of the exchange, reporters had uploaded the moment to Twitter, and by the time Crockett left the hearing room, her phone was already buzzing with notifications she could barely keep up with. The hashtags appeared almost instantly. 7th interruption. Truth hurts. Crockett vs. Miller. Memes followed, pairing Miller's frozen, stammering face with captions that twisted the knife. When you realize the truth actually does interrupt you. By the end of the day, the video had been shared across every platform imaginable. TikTok teens set it to dramatic soundtracks, some using slow-motion effects to exaggerate the exact moment Miller fell silent. On Instagram, Reels spliced Crockett's line with clips of cheering crowds, fireworks, even the iconic mic drop, animations that made it feel less like a congressional hearing and more like the climax of a blockbuster film. Cable news couldn't look away either. The networks looped the clip on repeat, each with their own framing. Progressive commentators hailed it as a turning point. This is what happens when you arm truth against arrogance, one anchor declared, pointing at the screen as if the audience needed reminding. Even some traditionally cautious outlets described Miller as visibly rattled, a phrase that became its own meme overnight. And then came the celebrity amplification. A-list actors tweeted the clip with fire emojis. Musicians quoted Crockett's line in all caps, posting it as if it were song lyrics. Activists latched onto it as a rallying cry, declaring that Crockett had not just silenced Miller, but symbolically silenced the entire culture of interruption and dismissal that women, immigrants, and people of color endure daily in public life. For them, this wasn't just politics, it was vindication. The villain, once smug and unshakable, was now a punchline. Screenshots of Miller mid-blink. Flooded timelines with sarcastic captions. Buffering. Loading response. 404 argument not found. Late-night hosts opened their monologues with the clip, reenacting his stammer, pausing awkwardly before delivering their own punchlines. The arrogance that had defined him for years was suddenly recast as fragility, exposed under the bright glare of Crockett's words. Meanwhile, Crockett's star rose in real time. Her calm composure became the subject of admiration. "This is Grace Under Fire," one viral post read, accompanied by a split screen of her still gaze next to Miller's faltering expression. Supporters praised not just what she said, but how she said it. The restraint, the precision, the refusal to sink to Miller's level. To many, it felt like witnessing a blueprint for how to dismantle bullies in power without raising your voice. But beyond the viral spectacle, there was something else happening, something quieter, deeper, and far more consequential. Because while the internet laughed, reposted, and memed, people began to reflect on why the moment resonated so powerfully. It wasn't just that Crockett had shut down a political opponent. It was that she had embodied what millions had longed to see, a voice that refused to be silenced, standing firm against a man who built his reputation on cutting others off. The narration drove it home. Memes can fade, clips can disappear in the endless churn of the internet. But sometimes a single moment carries within it the weight of a movement. And this was one of those times. Because this wasn't just about Miller being mocked or Crockett being praised. It was about power itself. Who gets to speak, who gets interrupted, who gets dismissed, and who finally turns the tables. And as the hashtags trended and the laughter rolled, beneath it all, a deeper current was building. Cliffhanger. But beyond the memes, something deeper was happening. In the days that followed, the frenzy of memes and headlines slowly gave way to reflection. What lingered was not just the comedy of Stephen Miller's frozen expression or the viral hashtags. It was the dignity Jasmine Crockett carried into that room, and the way she transformed blatant disrespect into a lesson on strength. She had been interrupted, undermined, and dismissed. But instead of lowering herself into the mud of hostility, she chose precision, clarity, and restraint. Her seventh line wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reminder that dignity is more powerful than arrogance. For women in politics, the moment echoed loudly. Too often, their voices are cut off before they can finish a sentence. Their intelligence questioned. Their authority diminished. Crockett's calm defiance became a symbol, a visual record of what it looks like to refuse erasure. She did not shout. She did not lose control. She simply held her ground, and in doing so, she illuminated the imbalance women face daily in spaces of power. The message spread. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks with measured confidence that cannot be shaken. The broader theme was undeniable. Respect triumphs over hate. Miller's interruptions had been fueled by arrogance, the presumption that his voice deserved to dominate. Crockett's response revealed the hollowness of that approach. Arrogance may momentarily silence, but respect endures. When Crockett spoke her line, she not only silenced her antagonist, but exposed the futility of his tactics. That clip became a cultural shorthand for a larger truth. Composure outlasts chaos, and the power of words delivered with conviction can dismantle even the loudest noise. Viewers who had long felt sidelined, immigrants, women, young people, communities of color, found themselves inspired by what they saw. Messages poured in from across the country, from classrooms to workplaces to homes, where people had been interrupted and ignored too many times. Crockett had spoken for them, showing that it is possible to push back without abandoning one's integrity. The scene resonated because it was more than politics. It was personal. Narrators framed it as a lesson. This is how the silenced reclaim their voice. This is how dignity defeats disdain. And as the camera panned out on the retelling of that moment, it became clear that the clip was destined for more than a news cycle. It was destined to live as a touchstone, proof that respect carries more weight than any insult, and that the calm assertion of truth can cut deeper than the sharpest sneer. Because in the end, Crockett didn't just win an exchange. She showed millions that silence imposed by arrogance is never permanent, and that, when you choose composure over fury, respect over hate, your words can reverberate far beyond the room where they were first spoken. 6 interruptions. 1 legendary response. That's what history will remember from this exchange. Stephen Miller's arrogance, his sneering attempts to dominate, became the stage on which Jasmine Crockett delivered a masterclass in dignity. In one moment, with one perfectly timed line, she flipped the script, not just on him, but on every person who's ever tried to silence another with sheer volume and ego. This wasn't simply a political clash. It was a reminder of something bigger, something all of us can carry into our own lives. Respect will always outlast arrogance. Arrogance burns fast and loud, but dignity, steady, measured, unshakable, creates echoes that cannot be silenced. And now, it's in your hands. If you've ever been interrupted, underestimated, or dismissed, you know how powerful that seventh moment felt. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that composure is stronger than chaos. Let it ripple outward, because the more we lift up examples of resilience and respect, the harder it becomes for arrogance to dominate the conversation. So, here's the call. If you believe dignity has the final word, if you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's deserve to be amplified, then share this clip. And if you're ready for more stories that cut through the noise, subscribe and join this community. Because together, we're not just watching politics. We're shaping the narrative of what leadership, courage, and respect really look like. 6 interruptions, 1 response, and a lesson for all of us. Never mistake silence for surrender. Sometimes it's just the calm before a legendary strike.